The sun had already begun to punish us by the time we'd crossed over Salt Creek. I was carrying the hamper and Muse came from within. Grandma had forgotten to drown the kitten. We walked a long way over roads we'd skimmed in the Terraplane 8. Mary Alice wasn't with us. She was elsewhere. Mary Alice was up to something. By noon, we were nearly out of the county. We'd crossed Route 36, but Grandma trudged on. We ate our lunch in a pasture. The kitten climbed out and fed from our hands. Then she stalked around in the weeds, teaching herself to jump at butterflies. When it was time to go, she climbed back into the hamper. We cut across the fields from there to a little house at the end of a faint lane. Somebody still lived there. Chickens were in the brooder house, and the garden was in and weeded. Hollyhocks stood guard along the fence. Grandma pushed open the front door. It was a parlor from some other time, with faded love knots in the wallpaper. Beside a cold stove sat an old lady. On the other side in a rocker sat the oldest man on earth, in a stocking cap. Grandma sighed with satisfaction to see them both breathing. Aunt May Griswold grinned at Grandma. Both her teeth gleamed in the gloom of the room. "How you been, Aunt May?" "Oh, yes," Aunt May agreed. "Very warm for the time of year." She wore gardening gloves and a variety of shawls. "How are your feet?" Grandma thundered at her. "Are they still swelling on you?" "Not bad," Aunt May said. "They're still pretty good layers. We get 8 or 10 dozen eggs off them every day and sell what we don't eat to the cowgills." Grandma turned to Uncle Grady. "Speak right up to him," Aunt May called out. "He's a little hard of hearing." Uncle Grady Griswold was almost as small as he was old. The pom-pom on his stocking cap hung far down his humped shoulder. He was so old he'd have made Aunt Puss Chapman look like a young girl at her first party. He gazed uninterested up at Grandma. "How you been, Uncle Grady?" she said, speaking up. "Fair to piddling," he said weakly. Grandma lifted the kitten out of the hamper by the scuff of its neck. "I brought you a mouser." Uncle Grady blinked at the hanging kitten and seemed to rally. "Put her right here," he said, and Grandma lowered the kitten into his bony lap, where she offered her head for petting. "Do you get up and around, Uncle Grady?" "Oh, yes," he said in a stronger voice. "I wrung the neck off a chicken this morning before daylight." "Did you have chicken for your dinner?" "No," he shook his head. "She got away." "Ah," Grandma said. "Listen, Uncle Grady, do you still have your old army uniform?" He started, and the kitten looked up in alarm. He waved 2 small shriveled fists. "Has war been declared?" He'd have jumped out of his chair ready to enlist, but Grandma put a hand on him. "Nothing like that," she said. "Well, I'm ready," he piped up. "I'm cocked and primed. My full kit's in the bedroom there." He pointed a crooked finger. "We sleep downstairs now because May can't climb steps. She's getting on in years." Grandma nodded me toward the bedroom. "Don't forget my sword," Uncle Grady called after me, seeming not to wonder who I was. Aunt May looked on, interested. I found his full kit: uniform, sword, boots and spurs, and a cap. They didn't smell very good, and they didn't look right to me. "Grandma," I muttered, holding up the small coat, "there's something funny about this uniform. The only Civil War uniform I'd ever seen up close was on Mrs. L.J. Wiedenback's daddy. Was Uncle Grady on our side?" "Of course he was on our side," she said. "But he goes back before the Civil War. He was in the Mexican War." "They winged me at the Battle of Cerro Gordo," Uncle Grady offered. I stared. We'd covered the Mexican War in school that year. "Grandma, the Mexican War started almost 90 years ago. Even if Uncle Grady is 103, he'd only have been about my age during the war." "Well, maybe he was a little drummer boy," Grandma suggested. "Rum-tum-tum," Uncle Grady said, playing an imaginary drum with invisible drumsticks. Grandma turned to the other rocker. "Can I borrow Uncle awful ready for the day on Saturday, Aunt May," she howled. "You sure can, honey," Aunt May said. "In fact, you can keep him." She heard every word and grinned broadly. On the first day of the centennial celebration, the town began to fill up with merrymakers and the curious. People came in farm wagons and Fords from as far away as Beemit and Tuscola. Grandma closed all her windows because the dust from the road never settled. People came for the events, the tree topping and chicken plucking competitions, and the chili cook-off. They marveled at the flower show put on by the ladies of the United Brethren Church and the mother-daughter look-alike contest, the spelling bee, the Illinois Power and Light Company's display on rural electrification, and the three-legged race. I hadn't seen hide nor hoof mark of Mary Alice all day. That evening, Grandma and I had a quiet supper at the kitchen table under the ceiling light and the flypaper strips. This was the night of the talent show. I knew we were going, even after she poured a second cup of coffee and stifled a yawn like she was thinking of bed. "Well, I guess you'll want to look in on the show," she remarked. But I was 15 now and wise to her. I stifled a yawn. "Doesn't matter to me. We don't have to stay to the end." She was on her feet now, making short work of the dishes. The stage was the bandstand in the park, lit with headlights running off car batteries. We chose a back bench because nobody wanted to sit behind Grandma, and we could see everybody from here. The audience was mostly town people because the farmers had all gone home to do their chores. But there was a good turnout. Mr. and Miss L.J. Wiedenbach were up in the front row. On a table by the bandstand waited the loving cup for first prize and the scrolls for second, third, and honorable mention. Just as the crowd was getting restless, the first act began, a man playing a musical song. Grandma sat through that with both hands clamped on her knees. Afterward, she remarked that it had been more salt than music. Then we had a barbershop quartet. Though they called themselves the Sons of the Prairie Pioneers and all wore beards, they were Mr. Earl T. Askew and 3 more of the sheriff's deputies. Practice had improved them some, and they didn't sing the night that Patty Murphy died in mixed company. They did a medley that included Just a Song at Twilight, and after a round of applause, came back for Sweet Adeline. Grandma wasn't about to clap for deputies. She began to fidget. The vocal part of the program continued with the choir from Miss Effie Wilcox's church. They did Sweet Hour of Prayer, The Old Rugged Cross, and I Come to the Garden Alone While the Dew is Still on the Roses. These got no response from United Brethren members, but the choir returned for an encore anyway with tambourines to sing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Scoop Me from the Mire, Take Me Up to Glory, Snatched from Eternal Fire.